Okay, so I don't really do out and out politics on this channel normally because I think that's something that you either do. Oh, I just watched the microphone there. I have had a few beers actually this afternoon. I'm on a coffee porter now, which is probably a Tory beer, I would think, a little bit upmarket. It's not your sort of Carling or something like that. Although it is from Aldi's, so maybe it isn't a Tory beer. I don't know. You can decide on that one. But I don't do the out-and-out politics normally. But what I want to do, because I think you tend to get a lot of political videos from people of less centrist positions, let's say. So I thought this might be interesting for people beyond the UK, perhaps, to try and understand a sort of centrist perspective on what has gone on the last 24 hours. With regard to the general election. So let me give you a little bit of background there with what has happened. I suppose I should give you a little bit of background with regard to our system and what has happened. So what we have in the UK is we have a first past the post system, as they have in the United States, and as they have actually in quite a lot of countries that are legacies effectively of the British Empire, whereby it's not a proportional system and it's not based upon the vote being apportioned to representatives, but each area has their own representative. Members of Parliament, MPs, there are 650 constituencies throughout the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And so therefore you need 326 to make a majority. Now what has happened in this particular instance? The background is that Theresa May, the Tory Prime Minister who had a majority already, she had more than 326, is that she wanted to harden a majority. I understand why she wanted to do that. There was a little bit of politicking, I think, involved there, in that she knows she had a good lead over Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, so it was sort of prescient that at that particular time that was a good time to call an election in advance, because she could extend her majority, but also with the Brexit negotiations coming in and looking when the next general election would be, you don't really want that just following on straight from the end of the negotiations. To have a period beyond that adds a little bit of a solidity to anything that you're negotiating. I think that's a more legitimate reason, and I think you've got to factor in those two things. So she called an election, and I think expecting at least the same majority, hopefully an increased majority there. That has not happened. So we have this situation now where the election is in some ways, she's still in power, right, and the Conservatives are still in power. So it's a win in those terms, but it's also a defeat. Somebody asked me this on Facebook and I said it's a little bit like Usain Bolt challenging me to a 100 metres race and beating me by a second, right? He's won the race, but effectively it's a defeat because he should be beating me by a whole lot more than a second. So the situation is that you really need to get 326 to have that majority, more than half of 650. They've fallen short of that, but they've fallen short of that by less than 10. And the Ulster Unionists, the DUP, which somebody asked me about that also on Facebook and said, what do you know about the DUP? And I said, actually, the only thing I've ever really known about the DUP is that they exist in Northern Ireland, and Northern Irish politics are quite separate to the rest of the United Kingdom. Regrettably, in some ways, is that they always tend to side with the Conservatives. But in many ways, they're to the right of the Conservatives. They're very much against gay marriage. They're kind of maybe not entirely on board with climate change. They're kind of a little bit more like the Republicans, I suppose, in the United States. Whereas if you compare them to the Conservatives, never mind Theresa May, if you think of David Cameron, who preceded her, who was the champion, right, of marriage equality for homosexuals, right? He's the right-wing party and the leader of that party. He was the champion of gay marriage. So that shows you there's a little bit of a difference there. But they side with the Conservatives and they will vote with the Conservatives. So you have a system now where effectively I think the Theresa May is going to go to the Queen and ask to form a government as a minority government. She will have less than those 326. But with the DUP, the Ulster Unionists on board, it will take her beyond that. Also bear in mind in Northern Ireland, I think you've got about 6 or 7 Sinn Féin MPs. Remember Sinn Féin, used to be like the political wing of the IRA. They're not anymore. They're a legitimate political party, but nevertheless, they're not really on board, let's be honest, with the whole United Kingdom thing. So they don't go into Westminster, they won't take their seats, and they won't vote in Westminster. So you can knock their numbers off, and you can also knock one off for the Speaker of the House, who never votes. So what you've got in the United Kingdom, bear in mind you have a system where most of this isn't written down, right? So pretty much, other than the fact that every constituency has a representative, all the rest of it is effectively just convention, including the fact that they form political parties, including the fact that we even have a fucking prime minister who forms a cabinet. All of that is just a convention. None of that is written down, which means it's a little bit up in the air, even with the convention, as to who forms a government and under what circumstances. So what will happen in this circumstance, I think, is that Theresa May is going to go to the Queen and say, look, with the assistance of the DUP, we will have a majority. Nobody else can do that, so we should form a government. Now, Jeremy Corbyn on the Labour bench has talked a little different line and said that there should be a sort of consensus that represents the people, as if he can make that consensus. I don't know how that works, because even with all the people like the SNP or the Lib Dems who could come on board with him, he would still have less representatives than the Conservatives and the Ulster Unionists. So I don't quite know how that works, okay? But I understand why he would play that game. Okay, it's kind of an interesting little situation that we're in here now, because the Conservatives have in some ways won but really lost, because they expected to do so much better than they have actually done. Okay, two things that I want to say with this, which has motivated me to make this video. The first is this thing, I mean, the press love to big these things up, okay? And one of the things they keep saying is that this is a kind of sea change in British politics, with regard to the fact that Jeremy Corbyn had a proper kind of left-wing socialist stance, especially with John McDonnell as his Chancellor. And, I mean, even the stance that John McDonnell took is clearly well within the confines of the kind of stance that John McDonnell would really like to take. Let's be honest with that. His politics is well to the left of what he's actually putting in the manifesto there from an economic perspective. So that's the way it's pointing, and they have done substantially better than everybody expected. But when we talk about sea changes, right, let's keep a little bit of a reality check here. Tony Blair, the Labour leader Tony Blair, he was a fucking sea change. And when he came to power, he overturned a Tory majority into a Labour majority of, I think, something like 172. That number springs to mind. It was certainly over 170. I think 172 seats, which is a fucking huge majority. What we're talking about here with Jeremy Corbyn is that his defeat is not quite as heavy as everybody was envisaging. You're still talking about his party being in the 260s and the Tories falling at about the 320 mark. You're still talking about a deficit of about 50 seats on the Tories. So I think we need to keep a sense of perspective here. But from me, there is still some concern here, because what it demonstrates to me is perhaps we're talking about more of the younger generation voting. And one thing that is true, that is long understood with politics, is that the younger generation have a more idealistic understanding of politics. Quite understandable. For two reasons. One is that younger people look at the world as it is, quite rightly, and want to think of the world how it could be, and of a better world. And let's be honest, left-wing politics, that is what left-wing politics offers. Left-wing politics is typically more aspirational. This is what we could become. This is what we could achieve if we do X, Y, and Z. Or if you're in America, X, Y, and Z. And so that is the nature of left-wing politics, and that is what young people are. And that is what young people should be in many ways. And of course, from a more cynical perspective, young people have less to lose. So if there's going to be a redistribution, they're going to gain as a result from that. And so it's not surprising that as people get older and have more to lose, that they drift to the right. Partly for the cynical aspect of now suddenly they've got more to lose and less than gain, so they're not going to be a net gainer anymore. They're not going to be given the stuff that's taken off people. It's going to be taken off them. So they're going to be a little bit less on board with that, let's be honest. It's like the Robin Hood thing, you know. If Robin Hood's given to you, then you're going to be more on board with Robin Hood than if he's taken from you. But there's also the fact that I think older people have seen a little bit more of the world and perhaps sometimes realise that these ideological goals maybe aren't quite so attainable. That was certainly my experience growing up at the end of the 70s and the start of the 80s and seeing how badly things had worked out. And despite some of the hardships and the nastiness in some ways of Thatcherism, seeing the necessary side of it at the same point. Right, and that is why economic politics in the United Kingdom and in Western Europe almost in totality has shifted towards the right, because it works in that sphere. So I kind of fear two things here, which is the slight drift towards economically, not socially in terms of rights for different groups of people, but economically back towards the left as a result of the kind of thing that people always fear, that we'll forget about the lessons of the past. But the other thing that I fear is that the success of Jeremy Corbyn has made space for the Tories to move to the right. I'll be honest with you, Tony Blair, Labour, the left-wing Tony Blair, was perfect for me. And David Cameron wasn't much different, really. I mean, there's always a certain sort of hatred towards David Cameron because there's a kind of, for all the snobbery in this country, there's an equal amount, at least an equal amount of inverted snobbery. And I think people didn't like David Cameron because he was a millionaire. Theresa May was not a millionaire, and that stands in her favour, even though her policies are more conservative and are more to the right, socially conservative than David Cameron's, which is kind of odd, but people respect the fact that she's not a millionaire. It shouldn't fucking matter, really, but that's the kind of way the UK is configured, I'm afraid. But the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is further left than his predecessor Ed Miliband, and certainly further to the left than the kind of people that would work for me, such as David Miliband, means, in my opinion, that in this election it has allowed the Tories to move further to the right. Why? Because they assumed a big margin of victory, which allowed their politics to drift to the right without losing the election. If Labour stands firm towards just to the left of that centre ground, it doesn't give the Tories any wiggle room. Effectively, by moving to the left, and I don't know why I'm moving my arms to the right every time I say that, but it's probably to your left, so it might pan out. It allows the Tories to do the opposite. So we end up more back in the situation that we had in the 80s, where effectively somebody said to me, well, surely this gives people more choice. In a way it does. But view it from my position. And my position is effectively that the political middle ground as it is effectively where my politics are. So you're going from a situation where the parties were sort of, I'm happy with 50. And the parties were 45, 55. And now I'm being given more choice because now we're going to have 30, 70. Fucking brilliant. Now we're going to have two parties, neither of whom are appealing to me, and actually I would suggest neither of whom are appealing to the vast majority of the British electorate. Most people in the British electorate would rather have a slightly more common path. It will be interesting to see if anybody heads down that common path and tries to do a Tony Blair, effectively, an appeal to that. I'm sure that will happen at some stage. But in the meantime, as I say, to me it seems like more of a polarisation. The Labour now have moved to the left, and that has been legitimised by the result of the election. And as a result of that, that has allowed the Tories to move to the right. Okay, let's watch this space, see what happens next. I hope you've gained something out of this. That just gives you my position. Not something I talk on very often, not something I'm going to talk on very often, but that gives you a little idea. Just to let you know, by the way, because I ought to, because people say, well, what did you vote? I'm somebody who's voted Labour. I'm somebody who's voted Conservative. My opinion is that I'm quite happy to vote for either. I don't have any particular party allegiance. I can see I have some empathy with the social side, with the welfare state side, that Labour tends to major on more, but I think they tend to live for the moment a little bit more. Gordon Brown aside, live for the moment a little bit more. That concerns me. The bigger picture, I think economically the Tories generally have been more on board with that, and I feel safer with them. I voted Tory this time with a very heavy heart. My position is that I don't like to see any party in for more than 2 terms. I think 2 terms is ideal. 1 term isn't enough. The problem is, after a second term, this is just a function of politics, which is that every party takes on board things which effectively become albatrosses around their necks. By which I mean things they wish to jettison, but it would be politically inopportune to do so, right? They would lose too much face. And you know that because as soon as the opposition comes in, on day one they go, we're getting rid of that, getting rid of that, getting rid of that, getting rid of that. A classic example with regard to something that featured with me in the fire service was this regional control centres, which the Labour Party had pumped actually hundreds of millions of pounds, in fact I think billions in these regional control centres, and they weren't working. But they couldn't really say, yeah, okay, we're writing all that money off, because it would have just been too much egg on face. Even though they knew, really. They're not stupid. They weren't stupid. They knew it was the time to jettison it. When the Tories got in under David Cameron, yeah, they're just gone. Right? And you need that kind of cleansing effect that we don't allow our politicians. It's our fault we don't allow our politicians to do that, because although we say we want politicians who will just be truthful with us and admit when they're wrong, we're talking shit. We always punish politicians when they actually do that, so we get the politicians that we deserve. So I always think that 2 terms is about the maximum. So I am more than ready to vote for Labour. But by Christ, when you compare the likes of Blair, Brown and Straw back in 97, or what did we have? Blair, Brown and Blunkett following on from that, people like that. When you compare them to Corbyn, McDonnell and Abbott, Jesus Christ, you know, it's not just a different league, but it's like one of them's in the Premier League and the other one's a non-league side. So never mind the actual politics and the policies. I'm not going to vote for that level of ineptitude when you have got a leader of a party who is trying to be Prime Minister, who has, I believe, the worst record in his party in terms of following the party line, in terms of following the party whip. And he's going to expect people within his party to follow the party whip. What grounds does he have to do that? What grounds does he have to lead and expect everybody else to do that which he has never done throughout his whole fucking career? When you have a chancellor such as John McDonnell, who is, I'm sorry, he's just so far to the left. Forget about his policies. Think about his fucking opinions. So far to the left of what actually works economically. When you have somebody like Diane Abbott, who can barely cobble 2 fucking sentences together without fucking it up, seemingly over the last few weeks, that level of ineptitude as a Home Secretary, as a Chancellor, as a Prime Minister, was something which is a little bit more than I can take. Policies aside, I would have hoped for a slightly more adept Labour, potential Labour cabinet than I was offered there. And that unfortunately meant that I had to vote for a Tory party that had shifted to the right, that in many ways I didn't particularly want to vote for. Okay, that's clarified my position. This is the end of the video. Thank you for watching. I'll go back into my beer. Thanks for watching. Well, you know what I'm trying to say. There.